My name is Marianne Duddy-Burke. I serve as the Executive Director of Dignity USA, and along with Russ Petras of Future Church, I'm a co-chair of Catholic Organizations for Renewal, which is sponsoring this session and the one next Wednesday, May 25th. Catholic Organizations for Renewal, also known as CORE, is a leadership forum of U.S. church reform organizations. The purpose is to further reform and renewal in the Roman Catholic Church, to build an inclusive church, to bring about a world of justice and peace, and to reflect the sacredness of all creation. CORE works collaboratively to provide an authentic Catholic moral voice on these issues and coordinates projects that further these goals. If you're interested in learning more about CORE, please visit our website, which I will be putting in the chat. We definitely welcome your interest. Tonight's session will help us all better understand the history of Catholic teaching on abortion, as well as how we might use Catholic social teaching to help us frame our thinking on this complex issue on a personal level and in the political and legal contexts of our society. To lead us through this tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Jamie Manson, President of Catholics for Choice, which lifts up the voices of the majority of Catholics who, in good conscience, support reproductive justice. Jamie is a longtime partner to many of us in progressive Catholic movements, and for many years amplified our work as a journalist. After Jamie's presentation, she will respond to questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please type it into the chat at any point during the program, and Russ will be collecting and collating them. Again, we have turned off the cameras and the chat for except to send questions in order to maintain the safety of this space. So now we are delighted to welcome Jamie Manson to help us better understand our church's history on abortion and reproductive health.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you, Russ. And thank you all for being here. We got an enormous response to this invitation for this seminar. And I think this is the moment where we need to be engaging in the issue of abortion, an issue that I think has been made so taboo by our bishops, our priests, that it has been hard to engage in it, even for the most progressive of us. And I will say, for years at the National Catholic Reporter, I didn't write about abortion either. I hope to share tonight a little bit of the reason why I became much more involved in the issue and how I think it intersects with so many of the issues that we're working on in church justice. I will note that this is part one of a two-part series. Next week, we will have what I think is a powerhouse panel on really the social justice elements of the issue. We'll have an abortion provider. We will have an expert in the white supremacist roots of the anti-choice movement. And we will have an expert who did a 10-year study of the effects of what happens when women are denied a wanted abortion. And so I think it's going to be incredible. And so I won't touch on the social justice elements as much tonight, as I will on more church teaching and the thinking of ancient and modern theologians about this issue. So thank you all again for being here. And I want to echo the apology for the, closed nature of this session. Unfortunately, the anti-choice movement is quite radicalized right now. And so we wanted to, again, maintain this safe space, just in case there was an attempt to disrupt this session. And unfortunately, the risk is high of that, which is why we didn't even put the invitation to this session on our social media. I mean, we tried to really keep it within this movement for church justice. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to talk with you about this issue, which you all know now, especially since the leaked draft of the Supreme Court memo is urgent. Those of us who have been watching the Supreme Court the last few months know that there was a very high chance that Roe versus Wade, that landmark decision from 1973 that made abortion legal in this country, that it would be either gutted or struck down. And I wondered sometimes how seriously folks thought were taking that, or how real they thought that was, or that can't happen in this country. Rights can't be taken away like that. And I'm the only upside of what happened last week with that leak, regardless of who did it, because we don't know who did it, is that hopefully it helped people see that this is very real. And for us as Catholics, our Catholic leadership has a lot to do with why we've reached this moment, a 50+ year campaign to get abortion rights ripped away in this country, and with their incredible overreach in the courts and in politics. And so I think that we have a moral obligation, I think, to talk about this as Catholics. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just here to offer information and ideas that I hope will help you in your discernment. Because as you know well, there are no inroads for a conversation about abortion in our church, not in the parish, not even in Catholic universities. It is still very taboo. And I know if something very significant happens with Roe next month, many of you will want to respond. And so I'm here to offer support and resources and information to help you make your own moral discernments and to, craft your own responses, because it is a morally complex issue. And I don't think we should be afraid to say that. And so that's why we're going to take you through some of this information today. So without further ado, let me start with the presentation. In order to understand the church's teaching on abortion, we have to understand the church's teaching on natural law. So let's start there. What is natural law? It's an idea that goes back to Aristotle, and it's the idea that everything in nature has a final purpose, or a telos. And we can tell what that purpose is by the way in which things flourish, how they come to fruition. And so when Christianity began to adapt Aristotelian ideas, especially through the work of Thomas Aquinas, the interpretation of these ideas was that we would know God's purpose, because God is the author of nature. So we would know what God's purpose is for everything in creation by studying its final purpose, or its telos, the way in which it moves to fruition. So struggle with the natural law is the way in which the church currently interprets it. They have a very biologically focused reductionist interpretation of natural law. And so the church's understanding of natural law is really the foundation for the teachings on contraception and on abortion, but also the teachings on same-sex relations and transgender identity, the ordination of women, capital punishment, and dying with dignity, all of those ideas, because we have this idea that life must go to its fulfillment. The purpose of life is to go to its final purpose, its final end. And so with abortion and capital punishment, dying with dignity, there's an idea that it violates natural law, these sorts of actions. In the terms of contraception, of course, we all know well, the church teaches the purpose of sex is procreation. And so contraception puts a barrier between sex and its actual final purpose, its fruition, so to speak. Same-sex relations, similar thing, because all sex acts must be open to life. Same-sex sexual activity cannot create life, biologically speaking, and so we're offending natural law. We violate natural law. The ordination of women is very similar. It's when natural law gets translated into this notion of gender complementarity. which is, of course, the understanding that men are supposed to be in authority and take leadership. Women are supposed to be vessels and in places of service in the relationship. Very strict gender binary understanding in Catholic theology at the moment. And so for a woman to want to be ordained would be a violation of natural law, because this is God is the author of creation, and God says only men are supposed to be in authority and take leadership, not women. And so this idea of natural law, again, it only really considers the human person as a biological reality. It doesn't consider who we are emotionally and spiritually. It does not take into account the complexity of the human person. But this is the bedrock of all of these teachings that I know many of us in this group are very outspoken about because of the injustices that they create. So let's talk about human reproduction. My slide isn't great there, sorry. This should say, how does pregnancy begin? So pregnancy can take 2 to 3 weeks to happen, believe it or not. It starts with ovulation. The ovaries release an egg, and then there is a 12 to 24-hour window for fertilization to happen. Fertilization is when a viable sperm reaches the egg after sexual intercourse, obviously. And then days 1 to 2, that fertilized egg transits through the fallopian tubes, and that takes about 30 hours. So the egg is moving. After it gets fertilized, it's moving through the fallopian tubes. Around day 2 to 6, a process called mitosis happens, and that's when that fertilized egg rapidly descends into the uterus after its journey through the fallopian tubes, and it starts to go through cell divisions that transform it from a zygote or a single-celled embryo to a blastocyst to an embryo with multiple cells. Around day 6 through 9, this is when things get particularly important. Implantation happens. So 6 to 7 days, 6 to 9, it all depends. Every person is different, but that's around the range. And that's those 6 to 9 days after that fertilization, implantation begins. And that's when this fertilized egg embeds or implants into the lining of the uterus. And that's really when pregnancy begins. And that's a very, very important point. All right, as I said, it could take 2 to 3 weeks for pregnancy to start. Now, in that journey of the egg before it implants, scientists estimate that 50 to 80% of those fertilized eggs will naturally wash out of the body, whether through the menses or other processes. 50 to 80% of those fertilized eggs never implant. Now, I want you to bear in mind now that the Catholic Church teaches at the moment that those fertilized eggs are life, and to destroy those fertilized eggs are murder, that they see that fertilized egg as a person. Now, as rational Catholics, let's think through this for a minute. If God is the author of this natural process, and this, according to the teaching, is life, why would God create a natural order in which these lives, so to speak, according to church teaching, are washed out of the body? Why would God create a process that destroys life like this? When you really study the process of pregnancy, you realize that that is the first fallacy of the church's teaching, because they don't reckon with this at all. And this is just science, and there's no reckoning. And my point in drawing this out is that it opens up, the very clear observation that the church teaching is not conclusive, that they have not reckoned with science, with what this means for God, with what this means for natural law. And so this is an opening for us to have a conversation about abortion in the church that our hierarchy just completely ignores. So let's take a look at the history of the teaching. Here I go with my inflammatory language, the anti-choice Catholics' big lie. And it is a big lie. I think we have to call it what it is. Anti-choice Catholics have this constant refrain. I hear it on Twitter 1,800 times a day, that the church is teaching that life begins at conception is unchanged and unchangeable. But an examination of history, the history of Catholic teaching on abortion reveals inconsistencies and unresolved questions. The number one unresolved question that I just pointed out, which is that 50 to 80% of conceived eggs, so to speak, are washed out of the body naturally. The church doesn't reckon with this at all. So let's take a look at what's clear. The first point is there is no mention of abortion in the New Testament, believe it or not. I know it is shocking. The only almost kind of mention of abortion is in the Hebrew Bible. It's in Exodus. And it's a passage about if a woman gets knocked over and she miscarries, whose fault is it? And from the way in which it is treated in this passage in Exodus, it's very clear that according to this tradition, the fetus is not a person. And this story is really important in the theology for Jews around abortion. And Jews do not have bans on abortion. And so I'm getting ahead of myself, but abortion bans are actually therefore an infringement on the religious freedom of Jews as a result. My point right here now, though, is that there is no mention of this in the Bible. There are, however, 30 mentions of conscience in the New Testament. So here's my warning label before we dive deep into church teaching. Nothing you're about to hear about church teaching around abortion was developed, influenced, or articulated by someone with a uterus. I think this is very, very important to point out before we start. And you could even point out that most of these teachings were developed by allegedly celibate men who have no real inroads to the lives of women. They don't have wives, they don't have daughters. And so it's really important to bear that in mind, I think, as we go through these teachings. So again, this is something I get hit over the head on Twitter with every day. The Didache. Never heard so much about the Didache on Twitter until you mention abortion. It's the earliest Christian document. And yes, it condemns abortion as homicide. Yes, it does. There's no reason to not admit that that is true. It is true. But it's the only Christian document that does. And all the early Christian theologians, as we'll see in a moment, did not consider it homicide. Now, what were usually the issues of abortion centered on in the early Christian thought? Usually it was abortion used to conceal the sin of adultery or fornication? And does the fetus become ensouled immediately or later in the development of the fetus? And so those are the two big questions that sort of plague the minds of theologians and the church throughout many, many centuries around abortion. It should come as no surprise that one of the lead theologians that we rely upon in our thinking about abortion is St. Augustine. He developed this idea of natural law. He developed the procreative norm that continues to plague us 2,000 years later. And because this is what he said, this was his idea that all acts of sex are intended for procreation. And he got as he got older and older, he got more and more increasingly sex negative, to the point that he said that procreation was the only redemption for the act of sex, because sex was so profoundly sinful for him, for a lot of reasons, including the loss of rationality that he thought occurred in sex. And so this was his idea, that all acts of sex must be, as the church still says today, open to life. He condemns birth control and abortion, not because he thinks that it's homicide, but because they violate sex purpose. It's that natural law we talked about a few minutes ago. That was why he was opposed to abortion. This is important to point out because, again, we have church people saying all the time that the church's teaching has always been, it's from the moment of conception, destruction is homicide, and it simply is not true. Augustine said only penance is required for the sexual nature of the sin of abortion. And he believed that actual human life began later in fetal development. He doesn't exactly say when, but maybe it's months, we don't know. The point is, in early stages of fetal development, he does not think that abortion is homicide. He famously said, "Who among us is not disposed to think that unformed fetuses perish like seeds which have not fructified?" So even he says, this is his way of saying in the early stages of pregnancy, this is a perishing like a seed. He recognizes that this is in a very, very early nascent stage. What happens in the Middle Ages? That should say penitential literature up there. Sorry, my very jazzy wallpaper is getting in the way of the words. Throughout the Middle Ages, abortion is treated as a serious sin, but it is one of many possible sinful acts. It's not considered homicide. In some cases, illicit sex acts, I'll let you use your imagination what those are, were more severely punished than abortion was. Bribery and theft were more severely punished than abortion was. And it was very rare that excommunication was invoked for a woman that had an abortion. The first collection of canon law begins, is compiled in 1140 by Gratian. And in this first compilation of canon law, by the way, the next compilation was 1917, gives you a sense of things. This first compilation of natural law has inconsistencies. One section says abortion is homicide when the fetus is formed, again, later in stages. Another says both abortion and homicide are condemned with a homicide level penance if abortion is used to fulfill lustful desires. So again, inconsistencies throughout, but still that sense of wrapping up sexual sin with abortion. There's an idea that develops later on with Augustine, and then St. Thomas Aquinas develops this idea centuries later, which is delayed hominization, it's called. So though the debate over whether abortion was homicide continued for centuries, the majority of theologians, including Augustine and Aquinas, accepted that notion, this notion of delayed hominization. What is it? A theory that posited when a fetus becomes ensouled. So it gets hominized. At some point, it becomes human. Or becomes when it gets a soul. So the notion of delayed hominization is that it doesn't happen immediately. It doesn't happen with conception. That is a delayed process that happens later in fetal development. These ideas are again based on Aristotelian science. Aristotle was a great examiner and observer of human life. He often would, dissect cadavers. He would look at if a woman miscarried, he would do a dissection. He was fascinated with all things having to do with human body and human development, physical, biological development. So he was studying this, and he thought that a fetus became ensouled at 40 days for male and 80 to 90 days for female. Now you're going to be shocked by this, but it's all about the penis, believe it or not, even here, as it always is. Aristotle noticed that there was genital development in male fetuses by 40 days. You could start to see male genitalia emerge. And that is why he's like, oh, that's when the male becomes ensouled, whereas the female genitalia would start to form later, 80 or 90 days in. So that was when the female got ensouled. So that is why we have this 40 days for male, 90 days for female. Now you ask yourself, how on earth would they have known when a woman is pregnant, what was developing and what wasn't? Who knows? The point is, this is the science, that our theologians, in the Middle Ages were working with, particularly Thomas Aquinas. Here he is. So Aquinas teaches it's not homicide until it's ensouled. So for him, that could be 50 days, 90 days into fetal development. He too, like Augustine, believed abortion and contraception were sins against marriage. He thought that the soul had stages of development, vegetative, animal, and human. I have heard theologians say that because of his sense of the stages of soul development, some posit that Aquinas thought abortion was not homicide up to the 6th month because of those stages of development of the soul. There are multiple interpretations of how Aquinas thought about this, but for sure, 40 to 90 days, he did not think there was a soul. Aquinas famously had this idea that body and soul were united as one, called hylomorphism, so that there cannot be a soul in a less than human body. A soul can only be present in a body that is capable of receiving it. So that is why he has these ideas of ensoulment being later or delayed hominization. This should say pre-modern hijinks. This is an image of Pope Sixtus V, one of the great papal names of all time. And you could see he's not a very happy guy. And he declares in 1588 that abortion and contraception are homicide. The end. Even contraception is homicide. Why? Well, the theory is he was concerned about the rise of prostitution in Rome. And he thought that penalties on contraception and abortion would diminish incidences of sexual sin. Not so sure that worked out. But he also said that the penance for using contraceptives or abortion is excommunication, that only the Holy See could absolve. This created a lot of bureaucratic issues, as you might imagine. 3 years later, Sixtus is dead. Gregory, his successor, Gregory the 14th, changes back to this notion of delayed harmonization. He says Sixtus's stand was too harsh. It conflicts with other theological views of ensoulment. And good Lord, this excommunication that only can be absolved by the Holy See is causing such a bureaucratic nightmare for the Vatican that we just cannot do it. The administrative difficulties are too much. So they threw out that idea as well. They said it's not homicide if the fetus is not animated. And so that's, again, animated, ensouled, quickening. You'll hear different words for it, but it's all the same idea, that when that fetus receives a soul. Now, this is the last pronouncement that a pope makes about abortion until 1869. So 1591 to 1869, they don't have much to say, kind of stick with whatever the theologians are saying. So what happens? A cult of the Immaculate Conception arises within the church, as only Catholics can do. And it increases papal support for the notion of immediate harmonization. So the idea was Mary had a soul as soon as she was conceived, right? That's essential to the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. She was free from sin at the time she conceived. So that's when this idea of immediate, that immediately there's a soul in the embryo. This is when this starts to take hold. The invention of the microscope also has an impact in the ether of the questions around abortion. The invention of the microscope notes the presence of ovum in women in 1827. Until then, theologians believed men, I know this will shock you, men were responsible for initiating pregnancy and women were just incubators. And so thinking about that theologically, thinking about this scientific discovery and what its implications are for theology, they said once they realized that Mary played a direct role in Jesus's conception, church leaders feared that Catholics might question whether or not Jesus was truly without sin. And so in 1854, Pope Pius XI officially declares, it should be Pius IX, officially defines the doctrine of Immaculate Conception and that Mary is free from sin. Got to blame a Jesuit. It's not a presentation for me if I don't blame a Jesuit for something. Jean Guéry introduces the notion that to kill a potential human being is to kill an actual human being. And this idea gets traction. This is happening around the time of the Immaculate Conception theological development. In 1869, this is when we have Pius IX ignoring this notion of delayed harmonization entirely. And he declares abortion is homicide with punishment by excommunication. And that's abortion at any stage in pregnancy. This happened around the time that centralization of the centralization of the power of the papacy was starting to rise. And when the papacy became this powerful, as we all know, theological debate started to get stifled. And so this is really when it happens. And so when Pius makes this declaration in 1869, but it's not codified until 1917 when we get that new collection of canon law. We got another Jesuit making a loophole, being Jesuitical. In 1924, Arthur Firmish, S.J., argued that therapeutic abortion should be allowed, sorry for misspelling therapeutic there, should be allowed for ectopic pregnancies and uterine cancer, since the fetus would die anyway. This is still very much a part of the teaching we have now. This sets the stage for this notion of double effect. What does that mean, double effect? It means medical procedures aimed at saving the life of the woman are permissible even when they directly take the life of a fetus. If there's not an intent to directly abort is involved, no blame for the homicide can be assigned. Direct killing of a fetus to save a life, however, is not allowed. It's a very confusing idea, as you can see. This idea is adopted by Pius XI in Casti Connubii. And this is when we get the idea communicated to doctors and nurses that they will be excommunicated for participating in therapeutic abortion. So in the Catholic Church today, there is a notion of indirect and direct abortion. It wrecks my head, to be quite honest with you. But really, the only time you hear about double effect is really if there is uterine cancer, is there ectopic pregnancies. But there are some bishops and things who even think for an ectopic pregnancy, you cannot abort. People take some very, very extreme views. But this was an idea developed by this Jesuit, that there are some very narrow circumstances in which if you're doing a procedure to save the life of a woman and is indirectly taking the life of a fetus, then it can be permissible. The CDF, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issues its declaration on abortion in 1974. It declares the fetus a human being from the moment of conception. This is exactly what some Republicans are trying to codify into law right now. It affirms a theology of the dignity of all human life. What's interesting about this, though, is that even though this is declared, it is still not a practice to this day to baptize miscarried fetuses or stillborn babies. And that suggests, and again, this is just about opening questions and finding the openings for discussion. Clearly, if there is not a rubric for baptizing miscarried fetuses or stillborn babies, the church is still making distinctions about what is an actual human being. And so it's just something to look at. When I did this seminar a few weeks ago, we had some Catholics in the audience who had some very painful experiences of being pastorally abandoned after a stillborn birth. And so it's a very interesting question, but for the purposes of this seminar, it does open up questions. What does Pope Francis have to say? Oh dear, where did good Lord, what happened with Pope Francis? Took away my slides. Sometimes he has that power. Well, good grief. Hang on, everybody. Aha. Okay. Oh no, this is seriously Pope Francis messing with my slides. Oh my goodness. Hang on one second. Let me see if I can get this back. I've never had a malfunction with this Prezi. I'm so sorry. Hang on. Oh, okay. I'll read it out to you. I have it on another. Let me see if I can share my screen. Hang on. See, Pope Francis always comes to get me at some point. Either my mic cuts off or something. Whenever I say his name, we have these issues. Let me see what's going on. I might be able to share my screen so we can look at the Prezi in a different way, but then you won't see my face. Let's see. And then when do we start again? Apologies, everybody. Let's see. Okay, we'll go back there. Okay. Well, let me read it out to you, and then hopefully the Prezi will pick up again. What Pope Francis says is he has stated multiple times that abortion at any time in fetal development is homicide. He has likened abortion providers to hitmen on various occasions. Now, even with all that said, in 2015, during the extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy, he allowed priests to use penance for people who have had abortions in a way so that they could refrain from excommunicating. Previously, the punishment was excommunication if a woman had an abortion. He allowed priests to just give a penance and let it be. In November 2016, the year after the Jubilee of Mercy, he made it a permanent policy in the apostolic letter called Mercy and Misery, or Mercy and Misericordia. And so now that is the current policy that we have from the church. Just want to make a few final notes till we get on to the next section, which I'm praying to God works for my slides. Abortion has never been declared infallible. That's lesson number one. Even though my Twitter people want to say all day that I'm wrong, it is true. The Vatican has never formally excommunicated any Catholic who supports abortion rights, though we know the US bishops went rogue last year and tried to create a letter, a pastoral letter, denying that would allow a provision to deny communion to elected officials who supported pro-choice legislation. The church, interestingly, has still never definitively said when the fetus receives a soul. This notion of harmonization, now they just say life begins at conception. They've never really talked about the ensoulment process. Interestingly, it's not an issue they discuss anymore. Most theologians admit we do not know when a fetus becomes a human being. And as I think we've pointed out throughout all of these different points that I've made in the last few minutes, is there is still need for clarification on the church's position, whether it's because of the treatment of stillborn babies, or this notion of when life begins and when, why 80% of embryos are washed out of the body naturally. Let's see now if I can go back to my presentation. Okay, so who is missing from this conversation? Women, people who can get pregnant. Now I say that because in honor to trans people, we know that there are people who do not identify as women who have uteruses, trans men, non-binary people, they can get pregnant too. So it's really important because we're watching the attacks on abortion rights and attacks on trans people happening at the same time for the same ideology. It's really important that in this presentation, you'll hear me say pregnant people or women and pregnant people to honor the intersection of solidarity we are in with our trans siblings. So who's not here? Women, people who can be pregnant, people who have children are not part of this conversation. And it bears repeating, women are not part of this conversation. This conversation is about fetuses. And yet, this is the story of women and pregnant people in this country. The story is that abortion is ordinary. It's quotidian. Every year, 6.4 million US women get pregnant. That doesn't account for the non-binary and trans men who get pregnant. Half of those pregnancies are unplanned. 50 to 60% of them got pregnant using contraception during the month that they got pregnant. 40% of unplanned pregnancies end in abortion. 39% of the people who have abortions are white, 28% are Black, and 25% are Hispanic. 24% are Catholic. 1 in 4 abortion patients in this country identifies as Catholic. That means it is the person in the pew with you, the woman who is teaching your child's CCD, the lector. The women of the church are having abortions. People in the church are having abortions. It's part of the life of the church, and we stigmatize it and we silence it and we call these people murderers, and we have got to reckon with that. 61% of abortion patients are already parents, already mothers. They already have at least 1 child. And approximately 1 in 4 US women have had an abortion by age 45. So everybody knows somebody or some bodies, many bodies, who have had abortions. And yet there is no factoring in of women or the pregnant people's lives in any of this theology. Why? This all goes back again to natural law and gender complementarity. It's what the teaching is that women's most essential vocation is motherhood. And so it's so important that whether we're talking about abortion or contraception or the treatment of gays and lesbians or the treatment of trans people, is all rooted in misogyny. It's all rooted in this understand that cis men are meant to have power and authority, and everybody else is meant to be in some role of servitude and not to have equal power. That men women and other gender creative people are not equal to men. It is embedded in our theology, and it expresses itself in all sorts of ways. And all sorts of injustices we see in our church. John Paul II, as you know, created the notion of feminine genius, as Susan Ross says so brilliantly, great theologian in Chicago. Feminine genius is a fancy term for the womb. It's this idea that women have this unique gift to give the world, that women are meant for childbearing, that they are meant to be mothers in every facet, in every way in which they move in the world, and that women have an obligation to continue pregnancies no matter what. And in some ways, and we saw this, the Magdalene laundries and most of women's history, particularly Catholic women's history, is that we are meant to suffer the consequences of our sexuality. There were no Magdalene laundries for the men that got those women pregnant. And so there is so much burden on women to be mothers, to say that this is meant to define their entire essential vocation in life. And so that's the theology behind so much of what we see in this anti-abortion movement that we see coming from the Catholic wing. I think that the real threat here is that for patriarchy in particular, and we know that the Catholic hierarchy is the most radical patriarchy in the world. Again, it is leadership by celibate men who have no real intimate inroads into the lives of women, don't have wives, don't have daughters. And so it's a hallmark of patriarchy to want to control the fertility of women and to have dominance over non-male bodies and the bodies of vulnerable men. That's patriarchy. And so contraception and abortion offer women and pregnant people the ability to control their own fertility. When women and trans people, non-binary people have that kind of freedom over their own bodies, it allows them access to power. It allows them freedom, access to social, economic, and political power. Now, this is not something bishops want. How do we know? Because they don't ordain women. They don't ordain women. They reject the notion that women are equal to men. So how on earth could they possibly support any right that would acknowledge that women and gender creative people are entitled to equal power and freedom? How could they? This is so important, I think, to understand why the bishops care so much about abortion and don't care about the other life issues, is because it's not about life. It's about the threat of women and gender creative people having access to freedom and to equal power. That is a profoundly threatening thing to these hierarchs. If abortion, again, the point should be made also is the US bishops say abortion is the preeminent issue. It's the greatest evil facing humanity. If that's true for them, why would they spare no expense ensuring social structures that would help people carry pregnancies to term? Now I'm seeing articles in America Magazine that say, oh, the bishops have said we will, give all of our support to supporting everything to supporting pregnant people. I'm going to watch very carefully to see how that plays out in a post-Roe world, because as they have beat this drum about preeminent issue, they have done very little to support other life issues. Let's talk a little bit about the framework, some other theological ideas. The way we think and talk about abortion in this country right now is to demand that women and pregnant people justify their choice. That is always what it's about. Why you have to have good reasons why you want to have abortion. And so what it does is it misidentifies the termination of pregnancy as the starting point for ethical discernment. It reduces a morally complex issue to a binary right and wrong. That is simply inadequate. So we have to change the questions, I think. We have to say the starting point should be the woman's life, the pregnant person's life, the life of the child bearer. That is where the starting point must be. You listen to anti-choice rhetoric and it's about fetuses, fetuses, fetuses. It's never about the child bearer. It's never about the person who is pregnant. I just saw an entire tweet thread by Father James Martin about this, and it was all about fetuses, fetuses, fetuses. P.S. Women have consciences, but no development, no acknowledgement of the fact that when a woman chooses to have an abortion, it's not only just about her autonomy, it's a choice that affects the entire trajectory of her life. whether or not she's able to feed the children she has, whether or not she can go to work, whether or not she can get an education, whether or not she has to be forced to stay with an abusive partner. Everything about the whole trajectory of her life is affected by this choice. And there's just not enough talk about that in this conversation. It ignores, most anti-choice rhetoric dismisses the value of the life of the childbearer, and it reduces pregnant people, women, to vessels, one in which the potential or theoretical life is privileged over the living and breathing person at risk. Now, this is a very, very polarized debate, and I want to make that clear. And there, with a perceived extremism on both sides, that I think, there is justification for those thoughts. A lot of people, especially Catholics I talk to, feel they don't belong to pro-life or pro-choice. It's not, and these camps are not adequate to describe their beliefs about abortion. Why? Because people have been pregnant. They understand the complexity of that process of the gestation. And I think that where the pro-choice movement has really come up short, and I would dare say why we're in this moment that we're in, is that the pro-choice movement has been hesitant to discuss the moral complexities of this issue and the complexities that arise for people. I think this complexity has been very well articulated by actually three women. I have two women, but let's talk about three women. The first is Sister Joan Chittister. People love this meme so much. Catholics love this meme. Non-Catholics love this meme. She says, I don't believe that just because you're opposed to abortion, that makes you pro-life. In fact, I think in many cases, your morality is deeply lacking if all you want is a child born, but not a child fed, not a child educated, not a child housed. And why would I think that you don't? Because you don't want any tax money to go there. That's not pro-life, that's pro-birth. We need a much broader conversation on what the morality of pro-life is. So what Joan is saying here is an interest in a deeper debate about what it means socially and politically to say we support life. Because the fact is that all of these Republicans who are voting, against abortion or to legally ban abortion or create restrictions around abortion consistently do not vote for policies that would support life. And so it really calls into question what's going on here. That's why I question the bishop's motives too. We have bishops that are opposed to the certification of the Violence Against Women Act, but save abortion as the preeminent issue. So what's really going on here? Frances Kissling, my predecessor, former president of Catholics for Choice, said something rather controversial in the movement. She said, the fetus is more visible than ever before, and the abortion rights movement needs to accept its existence and its value. She says the fetus may not have a right to life, but ending the life of a fetus is not morally insignificant. As she says, ending and termination of a pregnancy is not nothing. And her critique of the pro-choice movement is that it has acted like it was nothing. So it was many people who were making the messages. And so she wanted a more moral discussion, a more meaningful discussion of the moral status of the fetus, because the pro-choice movement has just failed to communicate effectively to people whose beliefs are uncertain. We didn't make space for people to discern, and I understand because the anti-choice movement has some very scary white supremacist, deeply misogynistic, elements in it, but it doesn't take, it's still a morally complex issue for people. And so the need to make space to have a much fuller conversation is demanded. But again, in our church, there are no inroads, no spaces for that conversation. I'll leave you with Rebecca Todd Peters. Just about see that. She wrote a book called Trust Women. It's a marvelous book. I highly recommend it. And what she says is we need a new moral language. Not only do we need to change the questions, we need a new moral language that expresses the complexity of pregnant body, the liminality of the experience of being pregnant, and the moral status of which she calls the prenate. She doesn't use the word fetus. She says it because she thinks that the word fetus constrains the moral imagination of what happens over 9 months of pregnancy. She says we need a theology of gestation. When someone gets pregnant, she argues that people change ontologically. Their identity is transformed in relationship to their pregnancy. Now, of course, this is not universal. Many factors affect how a pregnant person or a woman will interpret her intersubjective relationship with the prenate. And I think that that's where the real conversation has to be. And so she says this before I get to that. She also says about the prenate, perhaps we should think about it again, and looking for new moral language, as a human becoming rather than a human being, since being presumes a level of consciousness that cannot exist until after birth. So just finding new language, changing the questions, making space for the conversation, I think is urgent, regardless of what happens to Roe. This is what needs to be done because this issue will be with us. Women have always had abortions. They will continue to have abortions. And so this question will not go away. So it will continue to be urgent. I think the question is, do we trust women to be as capable of being moral agents? Do we trust pregnant people to be capable of being moral agents? When we can begin there, which we very often do not, it creates space for the ethical discernment that we need to do, not this polarized thing that we're seeing play out right now, but real ethical discernment. And it opens up the possibility of seeing abortion as even a moral good. But when we start with the life of the pregnant person, when we recognize that this is not just a choice about autonomy, it is about autonomy, but it's about the entire trajectory of someone's life. I'll leave it there. I've been speaking a long time, and I'm curious. I want to thank you very, very much for your attention to this. This is not the end, this is the beginning. Again, this is part one. We will take on a lot more issues next week, particularly around social justice. Again, looking more about the pregnant person's experience, talking about the reproductive justice framework, talking about the white supremacist roots of the modern anti-choice movement. So this is just a beginning, and much more will be discussed 1 week from tonight.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Really thorough, yet somehow concise exploration of the church's history on this and the complexities. So just as a reminder, folks, if you do have a question or a comment or something you would like Jamie to elaborate on a little bit, you can put that in the chat and I'll read it out. One of the questions I had, Jamie, and it's two of the first questions that are coming up, and I think in some ways we have like the perfect storm for the lack of this conversation, because we're looking for Catholic theologians to comment on this, right? We're looking for Catholic theologians to elaborate and have this public conversation about these very complex issues. But no Catholic theologian teaching at a Catholic institution is going to touch it. No Catholic journalist is going to probe it. Do you know of any theologians who are sort of emerging voices, especially in the Catholic tradition, who are breaking barriers and trying to find ways of exploring this conversation? And any book recommendations that you might have for us beyond what you've already given?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, it is amazing to me. I have tenured professors at Catholic colleges who will not write for our magazine contents, who will not openly publish there. And again, they're tenured and they're still so afraid. And it just shows the severity of the punishments that come just for even beginning to have a dialogue around it. So it's very, very hard. So yeah, a lot of the thinking is coming out of Catholics who are teaching at secular or not Catholic, religious but not Catholic universities. Kate Ott obviously is one of the people who has done a lot of writing. She was at Drew. Now she's moving to Garrett Theological Seminary. Emily Reimer Barry is someone who was, I think, writing a book. She's in Southern Cal. I can't remember what, I think she's actually, she might be University of San Diego. She's doing a book on the reproductive justice framework. Yes, you got the spelling right. Well done. That's forthcoming. That I think is going to be very, very important because, and we'll talk about this next week, but the reproductive justice framework was created by 12 Black women in 1994 who thought that the white dominant pro-choice movement was coming up short. Thank you, Lauren, USD, so a Catholic school. So they created their own framework and they said, choice is not everyone has choices. people who face systemic racism, people who live in rural areas, people who face systemic economic injustice don't have choices. Choice is the luxury of very usually white, wealthy people. And so they created a whole new framework. And that framework actually very beautifully parallels the Catholic social justice framework as well, about care for creation, rights and responsibilities, the preferential option for the poor, lifting up human dignity. As I often say, there is nothing dignified about forcing someone to give birth. And so there's not a lot of work right now. I mean, of course, Margaret Farley, Charlie Curran did marvelous work decades ago. And that work is still, I think, really valuable. But there was really a chill that went through the academy, particularly on this issue, that has not lifted.
A related question is, someone has read a piece in the New York Times that recommended a book called Abortion and the Christian Tradition by, or a pro-choice theological ethic by Margaret Kamitsuka. Are you aware of the book? Do you have any opinion on it?
I'm embarrassed to say I'm not aware of the book. I apologize. If there's a particular idea in the book that someone wants to bring forward that we can talk through, I would be happy to do that. But I do not know the book. I'm sorry.
Jamie, you haven't read everything that there is to read.
No, I know. So busy in this job, there's no time to read.
Yeah.
It's one crisis after the next in the field right
Nothing's going on currently right now, right? So,
yes.
someone else asked, I think, a good question, because there is a lot of, in fact, I saw a comment yesterday on Facebook that just about drove me crazy, was the majority of women choose to have an abortion to spare themselves some inconvenience. So I, of course, did the 24-hour rule and just sort of took a few breaths before I even commented on it, because that's not been my experience of why women make this decision, if they do have the freedom to make that decision. Anyway, their question is that you mentioned the lack of financial support for women who are pregnant. And are you aware of any studies that indicate the percentage of women who have abortions because of financial or economic reasons?
I think the Guttmacher Institute has those studies available if you want to check their website, and they're constantly doing new research about that. And I think it's an important question. But I think that even more than that, it's important, to remember that, again, we have to trust women to be their own moral agents, and to have, I think we have to get beyond this. Thank you. Get beyond this reason. She had a reason, because once you have a reason, you get judged, and I want to work toward a place where women don't get judged for making their choices, that they are just trusted as moral agents capable of making decisions about their lives that affect the entire trajectory of their lives, to do that.
Thank you. And on that note, one of the thoughts that I had, a recent popular Catholic magazine, America Magazine, released an editorial by their editorial board, and I don't know who makes up this editorial board, positing that there are basically two fundamental goods in opposition to each other: the life and dignity of the fetus and the rights and the autonomy of the woman, and that the Supreme Court was the wrong place to measure or weigh those goods, and that the better place to do it was in the states, and leave that to the state legislature. Do you have any comment on that as a framework for whether or not this conversation can be had amongst politicians or lawmakers, or whether this conversation is one that should be between women, pregnant people, their doctors?
Well, I think the idea that it has to go to the states is, I find that a bit scary. Honestly, I think about same-sex marriage, and that went to, if that was just left to the states. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the days where you could get married. I could get married in some states, in other states I couldn't get married. And that just doesn't seem like freedom to me. That should be guaranteed to everyone under the Constitution, honestly. And I think that, to me, this brings up a point that I've been, thinking about a lot. And if anyone on the CFC staff is here, they're going to roll their eyes. But I mean, we're having all of these troubles really because we're not guaranteed equal rights in the Constitution. Neither are trans people, neither are gay people, LGBTQ people, is that we don't have enumerated rights in the Constitution. The only people guaranteed rights in the Constitution are cis males, cis straight males specifically. And so I think this is why some people on this call will remember the Equal Rights Amendment fight. And this is why now we're seeing why this is so essential, is that we don't have those enumerated rights, and we use privacy laws. I think that's the real problem with Roe, is that it was based on privacy, a penumbra, as the justices put it at the time, an interpretation of privacy, but no real clear constitutional right to equality. And that is why people are saying very rightly that if Roe is vulnerable, so is Obergefell, with that guaranteed same-sex marriage equality. Loving that made interracial marriage legal. Griswold, that made contraception legal. This is very, very serious. Lawrence, that made same-sex sex legal. This is very serious, and all of those rights are guaranteed under the 14th Amendment, but again, in a rather amorphous interpretation. And so we're all vulnerable until we really have those rights guaranteed to us federally in the Constitution. And so the idea of things going back to the states, I don't find that just, and I don't find that honoring freedom and equality.
I'll just speak for the state of Ohio, if I could presume to speak for the state of Ohio. Many years ago, we passed a referendum forbidding the state legislature from drawing gerrymandered maps. The Republican-held state legislature has drawn up, I think, 5 or 6 different versions of the map right now that the Ohio Supreme Court has thrown out as unconstitutional under that referendum. So I personally have little faith that states are capable of truly carrying out the people's will. So just wanted to throw that a little bit in there. I know you didn't want to sort of cede the point that we need to have these reasons or justifications. But one of your wonderful staff members over at Catholics for Choice, Lauren, did indicate that the Turnaway study says that 40% of women say that financial reasons is the primary reason for women seeking an abortion. So that's 40%, at least in that particular study.
Great. And we will have the author of the Turnaway study with us a week from tonight, Diana Green Foster. And she could speak in much, much greater detail about that. So thank you, Lauren. Lauren's always saving me. And again, Lauren does it again tonight.
One thing that I wanted to back up on that you had mentioned sort of towards the beginning of your presentation was that the denial of abortion rights was an infringement upon the rights, the religious freedom of Jewish people. Could you speak a little bit more to that and perhaps explore maybe a little bit? I know you're not a world religions expert, but if you could speak to a little bit to Muslims and their understanding of this question.
Yeah, Muslims and Jews have, equally liberal understandings of abortion. Some Muslims and Jewish scholars say life begins at the first breath. And so, rabbis will say there is no ban on abortion at any stage, and Muslims will say that as well. Now, a lot of it is left up, these are traditions where you have a lot of interpretation happening from different teachers, but there is nothing in scripture, there's nothing in the Quran Well, there is teachings in the Quran, but you don't have these absolute bans. And the Quran, I think, teaches in the first few months, the fetus is water. And so they're just not they serve, there is nowhere in Judaism or Islam that says life begins at conception. These are not their ideas. And in fact, in Judaism, there are some laws in states that are trying to demand that fetal remains get buried. That is an absolute violation of Jewish law. And so this is the real problem here is what we have is Catholic ideology being codified into civil law, Catholic understandings of embryos, Catholic, being codified into law. And, good Catholics support religious pluralism. Vatican II had some exquisite teachings in the Declaration on Religious Freedom that as Catholics, we were supposed to honor religious pluralism, and that, that there should be a separation of church and state, and that we should have freedom to practice our religion and to be free of the religious beliefs of others. And what we're seeing now is a direct infringement on the beliefs of Jews, of Muslims, of mainline Protestants. And it's a violation. And it's very deeply troubling to me, again, because we're just seeing these Catholic ideas being codified into law. Now they're talking about this Catholic idea that I wrote about years ago in the National Catholic Reporter, that abortion, birth control pills, IUDs, are abortifacient. We have this now, this is coming back again. I wrote about this in NCR. You can look it up. I've heard people really, really like this piece. I've heard professors use it in their classes. It's called What an Abortifacient Is and What It Isn't. But this is a Catholic idea that somehow birth control pills, IUDs, can dislodge an implanted embryo. This is simply false. But they're making this argument now so that they can try to outlaw contraceptives. Also now, IVF is possibly going to be outlawed. Why? Because it involves embryos. That's, this is one area where Catholicism is especially fringe, is on IVF. Mormons love IVF. Evangelicals love IVF. It's just more babies. And so to see, when I heard that last week, that now IVF was sort of on the possible chopping block because of these understandings of embryos, I said, my God, now this is the clearest proof yet that this is fringe Catholic ideology getting codified into law.
Yeah, it strikes me that it wasn't that long ago that the country was grappling with whether or not to elect a Catholic president, lest the Pope basically run the United States. And here we have, a majority decision written by primarily Catholics. And it doesn't. I don't know that it comes as any surprise to anyone that the court has been stacked with Catholics, as this has been the ultimate goal, I think, of the anti-abortion movement for the last and the plot or the method that they were going to use was to strike it down in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, this is a 50-year long game played by the Catholic. It's a Catholic idea, the anti-choice, that was, we'll talk about this more next week, that was put on steroids by evangelicals in the late 70s when they really used it to animate their base. And you have the Federalist Society, which is run by Catholics, which was the group that vetted all the Supreme Court justices and put them before the president. You have the Becket Fund, which is founded by a Catholic, that is the legal representation for all of these religious freedom cases that result in tremendous overreach by religious organizations into civil law. So that's why I say, this is really a Catholic success story, a right-wing Catholic success story, but nevertheless. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That 5-4 decision, all 5 of them were Catholics. People say Neil Gorsuch, he was raised Catholic. Now he's Episcopal, but he was raised Catholic, so he has that formation still. But yeah, there are 6 of 9 justices are Catholic. One of them reflects the beliefs of the majority of Catholics in this country, and that's Sonia Sotomayor. The rest of them are really hard right Catholics that do not reflect the Catholic landscape in this country. So it's a profound imbalance, both in terms of the number of Catholics and the thinking of these Catholics.
Someone in the chat asked a question, and it's an interesting one. I don't know that any of us is necessarily qualified to answer it, but it's, should the Supreme Court be completely secular? No Catholics, no Methodists, no Protestants, no Jews, no Muslims allowed. I think, from my perspective, that seems to be against the American history and tradition of being a quote melting pot. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Jamie.
Well, I mean, I think that the court should reflect the landscape of the United States, the people of the United States. The United States is a very religious country, and that's just who we are. We are much more so than Europe, and so I would like to see a court that reflects the landscape. Now we're seeing that a little more with Ketanji Brown Jackson coming on the bench. I'd like to see a lot fewer white people. I'd like to see a lot more religious diversity on the court, just again, to represent the diversity of this nation, I think would be a good thing. But the fact is that, the three, God help us, Donald Trump in one term appointed 3 Supreme Court justices to the bench. This is unprecedented, I think. And they were put forward by the Federalist Society, a notoriously anti-choice Catholic-led organization, because they were anti-choice,
Okay, I think the questions have sort of slowed down. So I do have one last question, if you don't mind, and then we'll just sort of wrap up a little bit early. We had budgeted an hour and a half, but there's no problem in ending a little bit early. So I'm just going to read this question verbatim. The USCCB statement on direct versus indirect abortion states that if a woman is experiencing organ failure, that doctors say is due to her being pregnant, and the solution is a direct abortion that is not allowed. Interestingly, the USCCB author does not complete the logic and say, therefore, the Catholic bishops say that a woman with organ failure must die. Have you studied their statement, and do you have any comment?
I mean, I think it's the opposite of dignity. I think it's the opposite of life. I think it's cruel. And, that's something that struck me. And you all probably remember the Bishop Olmsted in Phoenix, this guy that tried to revoke all these baptisms a few months ago. He's a real hardliner, Bishop of Phoenix. When he excommunicated Sister Margaret McBride, it was a very similar situation where she was a mother of 7, that was going to die from extreme hypertension. And the ethics committee was a Catholic hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital in Phoenix, made a decision to save her life. And that meant the termination of the fetus. And, how does this respect life to leave 7 children motherless? I just don't understand. And again, it just goes back to the point of the way in which we treat women like vessels, and we privilege the rights of a human becoming, over the living, breathing person at risk. And I think it's cruel. I think it's unjust. I think it's the opposite of freedom, the opposite of pastoral care, and so that was my point, like with the Sister Margaret McBride issue, no one thought about the woman on the gurney. Everyone thought about Olmsted. They thought about Sister Margaret McBride. No one thought about this woman dying, and possibly 7 children being motherless. And so we just completely lose sight of the pregnant person and her life, and the life of her family and her other children and her spouse. To me, it's just a perfect encapsulation of everything that's wrong with the way we think about abortion right now in this debate, and the way in which Catholics write about it.
Yeah, I saw another post, and the headline of it was something like, "Thank God for the overturning of Roe, then get to work supporting pregnant women." And I thought to myself, women are going to die.
Yes.
Families are going to fall into economic ruin. children will be orphaned.
Yes.
This is what's going to happen. And why are we thanking God for that? Regardless of where you stand on
Right.
whether or not, women and people capable of pregnancy should be allowed to have an abortion. I don't think I thought it was an affront, a sacrilege to say, let's thank God, knowing that these are the ramifications. And that was, I think, like you're saying, Jamie, that sort of perfectly encapsulates the way we talk about this conversation. It's all about the fetus and has very little to do with the woman.
Yeah. And the fact is, women do die, and they have died, and they've died for decades, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, where the church has even more power over the state. That is what motivates me. I do the work I do at Catholics for Choice because people are suffering, women are dying, children are orphaned, because as a direct result of Catholic doctrine and the overreach of a radical patriarchy. And so this is why I do the work. It's all about this incredible suffering that happens when we cannot, make decisions, and the decisions that for some people are profoundly hard. Why do we make them even more difficult? Imagine how that, again, going back to the Margaret McBride story, imagine how that woman, that mother felt that this nun got excommunicated, that this priest lashed out. Imagine how that experience for her. We just don't take any of this into account. And it's a spiritual violence, I think. And again, because of the preponderance of Catholics that have abortions, it's a spiritual violence that we sit back and call them murderers and make no room for a conversation or to hear their stories. And it's time that we do that we make the space. The way in which we made space for women's ordination conversations and LGBTQ and trans conversations, we have got to make space for this conversation.
Thanks, Jamie, for giving us some tools and helping us to understand the complexities that we really do need to grapple with, and that we need to be talking about in new and fresh and faithful and respectful ways. So thank you so much, Jamie.
My pleasure. I just want to say quickly, I know we couldn't have small groups because, again, the threats to our safety. But I want to encourage folks, if they know each other on this call, I would encourage them to form their own small groups, maybe in the days ahead, and have conversations about this content with each other. I'm sorry we couldn't do it tonight. I hope you understand why, but I really want to encourage continued dialogue about this in small groups. Sorry, that's all I have to say.
No, that's great. Yeah, and a very good suggestion, because I do know, just as we're wrapping up here, one question that did come into the chat was about how do we talk about this in our parishes, and one of the things that Future Church has always recommended on whatever the issue is, find your people in your parish and start small. It doesn't need to be a parish-wide effort. It can be 2 or 3 people having conversations and building that network and that safety net and that community before expanding the group. All right, I do think I need to turn things over here to Mary Ann to close us out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and for your wonderful questions in the chat.
One last thing, Mary Ann, are we recording this and are we making it available?
Yes, we are. We have been recording this. We will be making this available, and next week's session as well. Yes, and just to pick up on the point that Russ and Jamie were just going on, I remember when we started the whole same-sex marriage campaign, we encouraged Catholics to engage in living room and dinner table conversations with each other, because it is really a responsibility to keep these conversations going in places that are safe for one another and where you can really have an open exchange of ideas and questions. And there's a lot to grapple with around the issues of abortion and reproductive health and our political climate and what our church leaders are doing and what we're seeing in Catholic media. And really, takes a lot of work to process it. And thanks to Jamie for helping us frame some of these issues. Thanks to everybody who's here tonight for taking this step in your journey to engage with these issues in a really intentional and conscientious ways. We do have a lot of work to do, whether Roe stands or falls, as it seems likely to. So we hope that tonight's session and the one that we will have next Wednesday, May 25th at 6:30 Eastern. Note that we are starting an hour earlier because of the schedule of some of our panelists. And we will be sending you reminders about that. But if you still have it in your calendar for 7:30, let's move it Eastern time. Let's move it an hour earlier. Again, if you are interested in the work of CORE, that has brought you this session and next week's session, the work of our member organizations, and anything else about us, please visit our website, which I've put in the chat. And again, on behalf of all of our CORE member groups, we hope you found this evening's session helpful and stimulating and soul-provoking, and that you will join us again next week. Thank you all, and have a very wonderful evening.